It's D-Day in the United States of America, and whoever wins, the impact will be felt across the world. What does this election mean for India? Does it matter to us who is the next president of the United States? Remember, this election is coming at a time of some friction between India and the United States. I'm Barkha, you're with the Mojo Story. We're looking at whether it will be Donald Trump or Kamala Harris as the next president of the United States of America. Trump and his supporters are confident of a comeback to the White House, even though this is a campaign he has run as a convicted felon. On the other side, his challenger is Kamala Harris, with a clear Indian connection that her critics say that she sometimes somewhat disowns. Either way, watching these elections unfold from here in India, the question that everybody must be asking is what it means for us. How will the next president impact not just our relationship with India, but also geopolitics across the world at a time when there are two live conflicts, Russia Ukraine and Israel Palestine? A lot to talk about in an election that has perhaps divided the United States of America like none other. Also, the United States of America finally looking once again, after that lost chance for Hillary Clinton, at the possibility of having its first woman president, still only a possibility, as a dead heat continues to define the polls out of the United States of America thus far. On D-Day, welcome to the special programming on the Mojo Story. Let me introduce our guest, veteran diplomat, Ambassador Manjeev Puri is with us. Welcome to the program, sir. Also joining us on the program today is Cleo Pascal. Welcome to the program. You're, of course, with the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, and it's a pleasure to have you with us. Suhasini Haidar, senior journalist, diplomatic editor at The Hindu, is with us, and Dr. Sanjay Baru, who has previously served in the Manmohan Singh administration, should be with us in a moment from now as well. Let me start by asking what the stakes are, both for India and the world. Ambassador Puri, one school of thought suggests that there is an institutional relationship between India and the United States of America. It doesn't really matter. It's America's internal business. There I say Sanjay as well. Welcome, Sanjay Baru, to the program. Does it matter to us? Do we have an opinion? Not as a state, but as individuals, do you think it matters? Is one or the other president or party better for Indian interests?
Parka, thank you very much. First, let me say something which I mentioned to Suhasini a little while back. Whichever way, we'll have an Indian either in the White House or in the Blair House. Isn't that wonderful? Let's start with that. Secondly, I think we should be cognizant of this institutional arrangement. And, while we may just poo-poo it or just say, oh, of course, that's true, but that doesn't matter. It does matter. Because India is now a country of interest to big powers, and a country that matters, the largest society, the fifth largest economy, so on and so forth. We are a country that matters. We've had good relations with President Trump when he was the president. We had good relations with the Biden administration, of which Kamala Harris was the vice president. So I don't see much change. But, of course, we, as individuals and otherwise, have a right to have an opinion and a feeling. The general perception, in my understanding, in India would be that a Trump presidency would go down well with us. Why? For a variety of reasons. We'd have some policy space, both internal and external. There would be perhaps greater pressure on China, fossil fuels, climate change. We'd have a greater policy space there. But I think, on the other hand, we must be quite cognizant that Trump, in his transactional manner, can be quite harsh on trade, on investment, all these issues, as well as on migration. And those are not particularly subjects that we can look the other way and simply forget about. Kamala Harris, on the other hand, I would imagine it would be more of Biden, more of the old Obama, the Democratic kind of thing. We've done well with them. We've certainly done well with them. And there would be a kind of predictability, which in itself is good as far as India is concerned, as we climb, higher up on the global table and so on and so forth. So let me put it like this. Of course, we would do well with both. The general feeling, in my understanding here, is many people wish that it would be Kamala Harris, but say that, well, Trump might just be better for us.
So if I were to decode that sentence further, Ambassador, basically what you're saying is that personally, there might be people who prefer Kamala Harris, but as a country, Trump and the Republicans have historically been better is one Indian view, and you hold on to that view, despite
Well,
Trump's intrinsic kind of instability and volatility, certainly as an individual.
no, you're absolutely right. Look, we have over the last 15, 20 years, if you look at it, it's been Republican administrations where, we managed to get things done, greater policy space for India, space to grow our economy, and so on and so forth. Of course, we've understood it's come at a certain kinds of price in terms of global stability and so on and so forth. But, we also have a little bit of an advantage geographically. The fighting across the children of Abraham are at it. There's an elements in the Indo-Pacific. We identify ourselves with it, but we are just slightly, let me say, westwards of that. So there are lots of those particular elements. This is the way I would look at it. Republican administrations have been slightly better as far as we are concerned, but absolutely no issue in dealing with a Democrat administration and taking things forward, because we are well placed to do that.
Dr. Baru, do you want to add to that? In your previous avatar as somebody who advised Manmohan Singh, you saw that India-US relationship when the nuclear deal was being negotiated. There seems to be near consensus in India foreign policy circles that a Republican presidency is less biased, more open to Indian interests, whatever the American people may think about it. Is that a view you share?
Well, I mean, that's based on the experience with President George Bush, who really single-handedly moved his administration into getting the nuclear deal done. But, frankly, the past is no indication to the future, because the world has changed. There's a fundamental change in the relationship between major powers, as well as in our relationship with the United States. There are fundamental changes within the United States, which this election has already reflected. So I don't think we can go too much by past experience in trying to understand, where we are today and where we are likely to be in the next 4 years. First of all, I think it's the reality is that Indian Americans in the United States are mostly pro-democratic. You saw the latest survey done by Carnegie Endowment, I think, which shows almost 70% of Indian Americans are with the Democratic Party. And Kamala Harris is a product of that Indian American community, which is largely with the Democratic Party. But at the same time, the fact is that the Democratic Party has been a difficult party for us to deal with. And it may become even more difficult depending on what happens in this country. Because the fact is that some of the problems we have been facing are not just because either Republicans are there or Democrats are there. It's because the BJP is here. And I think that is part of the problem in our relationship with the West in general, with the United States, with Canada, with Europe as well. So it's not, the determining factor would be how we play the game at home and how we relate to this new administration. Let me stop at this stage in responding to your very specific question. I do think I'll have more to say about where the world is going.
World is headed. Yeah.
And it looks like Kamala Harris stands a decent chance of winning. And whether it will be Biden too or whether she'll be Obama too, we'll have to wait and see.
Right. It's interesting. It's a dead heat election, and nobody I know in the United States of America is actually willing to call it. Cleo, what's at stake? The Indian perch is a bit different, right? We're, of course, looking at this through our own national interest. What's at stake, when you see it from where you are?
Well, so I'm in DC and hoping that we're not going to see sort of fires on the horizon. I think it was brought up what the time between now and inauguration, whoever's inaugurated, is going to be somewhat tense, regardless. But the stakes are exceptionally high. And just to go on to this issue of how a Trump presidency or Biden 2 or 3 or however you want to put it, Harris presidency might affect India. I'm actually Canadian, so I first of all have to apologize to everybody on the panel for the behavior of my country, but also that tweet, the Diwali tweet from President Trump, that will be noticed in Ottawa, for example. So if he wins, you might see a very strong change in behavior from some of not not only the US, but US's partners on how they're treating India. So it's worth triangulating some of the behavior. China also, I think, would probably be put on guard. If you take a look at who he has around him, it's a lot of people from the past administration, which is the one that resurrected the Quad, the one that signed all the deals with the defense agreements with India. So it has the potential to be functionally very different, including for some of the Five Eyes partners in their behavior with India.
Right. And of course, according to MSNBC, the first presidential election results did come in overnight. The 6 residents of Dixville Notch, New Hampshire, cast their votes at midnight, and it ended in a tie, 3 for Trump and 3 for Harris. So this is what the dead heat looks like. So Hasini, there's been, and first of all, Cleo, you don't have to apologize for Trudeau. I just wanted to say that it's gracious of you to do so, but you're a person in your own right. Thank you, nevertheless. So Hasini, the dead heat, yes, but there is some criticism or some debate in the United States of America over Kamala Harris owning or only partially owning her Indian roots. She speaks of her mother often, but Trump has sort of targeted her for sometimes being Black and sometimes being Indian. Of course, the truth is that, like so many people, she's a hybrid identity. Do you think that Indian Americans are a factor at all? And Cleo's very interesting point that Donald Trump did make a mention of attacks on Hindus and other religious minorities in his Diwali tweet. There's a sense among Republicans that could move an estimated 200,000 votes, which can make a difference in a dead heat election. How are you looking at the role of Indian Americans in this election?
Well, I think, as it was pointed out, Indian Americans are traditionally pro-Democrat. Because the idea of an immigrant community, like the Indian Americans voting for a platform that is, let's face it, is looking to curtail immigration, seems counterintuitive. However, we have seen in the last few years a move. So that figure of 70% of Indian Americans now saying that they will vote Democrat versus 30% was actually much more. I think if you looked about 10 or 15 years ago, it was probably closer to 78 to 80% of Indian Americans who were voting very, very decidedly Democrats. That's where we've seen more Indian American candidates as well. And that has also shifted. If you look at this election, Vivek Ramaswamy, Nikki Haley were Republican candidates. And of course, we have, as Ambassador Puri said, the possible the vice presidential spouse being of Indian extraction as well. I think, the question you were asking is what Mr. Trump asked less politely, is Kamala Indian American enough? Mm-hmm. Is she hiding her identity in that sense? I have to say, I have been watching her speeches quite closely. I see a real decided attempt to not speak about her personal identity. She speaks in most of her speeches about being of a middle-class extraction. And yes, as you pointed out, her book, she often remembers her mother in her tweets, but her grandfather, I think, as well, her Indian grandfather. But I don't see it in the speeches. The speeches have been much more about perhaps a middle-class identity than either actually overtly saying that she is African-American extraction, and she's actually Jamaican-American extraction, or of Indian-American extraction. I would also like to push back, Barkha, on this idea that Republicans versus, and let me be very clear, I think India is prepared for either candidate to win. I think both candidates would mean if you look at the last 25 years, there has been no year in which India-America ties have not progressed, or at least have not regressed at all. So some years they progressed further, some years less, but actually you've seen year-on-year progress. So I have no doubt that whether Mr. Trump comes to power, Ms. Harris comes to power, or even if we see a period of chaos, frankly, which is the third option now in the room, we're not going to see a change in the India-US equation. But I do want to push back on this idea that somehow the Republican administration has been better for India. And just look at the last Trump administration. It was a period of real uncertainty. We didn't know what he would wake up in the morning and tweet. Even on China, sensitive issues, we saw put out an entire conversation with Prime Minister Modi in the public domain. He spoke about mediation on Kashmir, for example, in a meeting with Imran Khan. He is the single president to have withdrawn India's GSP status, which was very important for our exporters, and never made an attempt to give it back. And of course, the Democratic administration has not actually been able to do that either. He badgered India on tariffs publicly, whether it was the Harley-Davidson deal or others, made a fuss about the fact that India was not moving ahead. And it was actually a lot of very public sort of hectoring of India at the time. And we've seen some of it in the campaign as well. And finally, on climate change, he came to power, walked out of the Paris Accord, and then cancelled India's climate funding that Mr. Obama had actually promised to us. So I want to push back on the idea that it's all been great with the Republicans and not so much with the Democrat administrations. I do think you will have different qualities to the leadership, regardless of who comes to power. One necessarily will be a little bit of legacy, a little bit of what we know in the last 4 years. One will be a little bit of what we know from the previous 4 years. Let's not cloud our memories about just how good or bad the last 4 and the 4 before that were.
I'll take that back to Ambassador Puri and to Dr. Baru. But Cleo, if you want to add to that in terms of the impact on geopolitics, not just on India, the one thing that even his critics tend to grudgingly give Trump credit for is that he wants to close conflict. He doesn't want the Americans involved in conflicts around the world. His supporters have been claiming that Russia-Ukraine could be solved in 1 week if Trump became the next president. Less confident about Israel. The Americans seem to have lost completely control over Netanyahu in any significant way. What do you agree with Suhasini that there's sort of a bunch of assumptions here in terms of what a Trump presidency might mean, and the very fact of his individual volatility in itself makes his presidency entirely unpredictable?
I think Suhasini's characterization of sort of the Trump Harris or chaos of the immediate period also could apply internationally. He's not operating in a vacuum. So we'll see what happens, whether how the Russians respond, but specifically how the Chinese respond, because the Chinese have a big hand in a lot of this, and they didn't fare well last time around. I'm personally concerned if he does win that the period before the inauguration could become very dangerous. They might see this as sort of a moment to strike or at least to push a lot harder. The U.S. military is in a weakened position. They're declining in the number of ships. He's come in and he's said that he will start to rebuild the industrial base and make it more capable. And I expect there would be a lot more files where DoD is taking the lead as opposed to State Department. Now, it's very hard to know how that will play out, but I think that the China focus. Senator Vance has been very clear on his China focus, and the people around former President Trump in the last administration have been very clear on the China focus. And if he manages to do what he says he wants to do, which is make them think he's crazy and unpredictable, he thinks that'll rein in their actions, but we'll see.
Yeah, Ambassador Puri, let me bring you in on Suhasini's pushing back on the assumption that Republicans are better for India. She listed a whole bunch of sort of conflicts that took place between India and the Trump presidency. Trump actually called India an abuser when it came to tariffs. He almost meant it as a compliment because he followed it up by saying, "Oh, they're very clever." Great amount of personal praise for Prime Minister Modi. Clearly some sort of actual rapport there that goes beyond the relationships between the two countries. But that assumption that we're making that somehow the Republicans are less interfering, the Republicans have made much of the fact that Kamala Harris has been what they call, quote unquote, radical on Jammu and Kashmir in the past. How do you respond to this pushback from Suhasini?
Barka, thank you. And I'm so glad Suhasini said what she did. And I really wish many more people in India would listen to her because she's absolutely spot on. But you forget Ab Ki Baar Trump Sarkar, you forget all those other things. That's how public perceptions get made. For me as a professional, all the points that she said are important, which is why I believe we can tackle both and we can do business with both, and we are a country of interest. So I have little issues on that. For me, in fact, the most important, dangerous point vis-a-vis Trump is his nature to be transactional. And we are sort of presuming this business that he'll be hard, tough on China, etc., etc. This guy can do a deal with it. And then where are you going to be left with? That is very unlikely under the Democrats. That's the bottom line in this whole thing. Perceptions are not necessarily built as a result of all these minutiae, which are pretty important, and so on and so on. And so, therefore, when I said, this is the general feeling, I think, among people, including in our circles, that's what I meant. My own understanding of all this is that the nature of Mr. Trump is such that the one thing that we feel a little better with that is policy space. And Sanjay said it very well. He said that, it's the government in power here and the feeling on all of that. But, that's par for the course. Who else are going to make the judgments? The broad spectrum of people, as well as those who are in power. The rest of us, well, great, we can write some articles. That's the nature of this entire understanding, which is why, which side would it lean? There would be, let me say, a little bit of hidden disappointment if this tie went bluewards. That's the nature of the game. I noticed something very interesting. Last time, 4 years back, almost all channels in India were running non-stop cricket commentaries of the US elections. And this time, that's not happening. Many are doing shows like you, analysis, no 24-hour commentary on what's going on. That may have something to do with the Panoon and those factors, but no. But I think it's also something to do with this particular element that we are talking about, it might go the other way. It might become blue. So
yeah, no, I think that's an interesting observation. It's the first US election in years that I haven't actually covered on the ground. And India, Canada, other stories have overshadowed it. But it also points to, contentiously, I might argue, the sense that, America doesn't have that place in the world that it once did. But that's a whole different debate. I want to welcome Joe Walsh to our program. Good morning, Joe. Joe has, of course, been a Republican who ran for the post of president, is today endorsing Kamala Harris, is a fierce Trump critic. And Joe, I'm going to come to you in just a moment. Dr. Baru, if you just want to add to Ambassador Puri's point about, Trump is too transactional for any country, even India, to assume, Trump will be better for us, even if he'll be worse for the Americans.
Yeah, first of all, I don't think, as Suhasini correctly summed up, that Trump was any better than Obama for us. Just because he walked around Houston with Narendra Modi in that rally, etc. The public perception is of a friendly man, but his actions were not particularly friendly. Frankly, I go back to the larger issues. I think we are today in a very different situation, both internally in the United States, internally in India. We have a weaker government in the center here, unlike in 2019, when that whole bonhomie of Trump and Modi kind of played into the media. We're talking about how media covered, like a cricket match. But today the media is sobered down 5 years later. I think we are in a very different situation today to be able to predict about the future on the basis of the past. Whoever is president of the United States, Kamala Harris or Trump, we are going to be dealing with a transactional presidency. Because a lot of the tensions in the world, whether it's Ukraine and Russia in Europe, whether it is Gaza and the Israelis in the Middle East, whether it's China and Taiwan and South Pacific, whether it's a climate change issue, whether it's a world trade issue. There are so many issues in which the United States is increasingly asserting its position in order to retain its position. It's dealing with a world, that is resisting American dominance, as we have seen, the number of countries that want to join BRICS, for example. China is assertive in the East. Russia is assertive in Europe. Israel is assertive in the Middle East. Israelis are not doing exactly what the Biden administration would have liked them to do by this time. And so we are in an unpredictable world. And India, India is doing things which it did not do before, like sending chaps and bombing off, on American soil. Because we are dealing with a serious case in the American courts. So, in this situation, my assumption would be that whoever is the president in the United States would be transactional. What's it in it?
Okay.
What's in it for me? What can India do for me? And in what way can we take this relationship forward? So the transactional aspect will be there.
Will apply to both.
irrespective of
Will
which
apply
of
to
the two
either.
presidents.
Okay, let me bring in Joe. Just for a moment, stepping out of our very microprism of what it means for India, let's ask the country that's voting and counting today what it means for them. You've been a Trump critic for a long time now, and you have been a Republican. You're not the first Republican who's actually endorsing Kamala Harris in this election. What's at stake? Democracy, liberty. These sound like truisms when they get repeated too often. What's specifically at stake, and what's the election looking like?
Good to be with you all. Well, right now the election is a tie, and nobody knows who's going to win tonight.
Mm-hmm.
What we do know is this: only one of these two candidates will not accept the result if he loses, and that's Donald Trump. We talk about a threat to democracy. Understand something. In the 248-year-old history of this country, only one American president has lost an election and refused to accept the result and refused to concede. And then, oh, by the way, committed crimes trying to overthrow an American election. I mean, when we talk about a threat to democracy, that's what those of us who are critics of Donald Trump mean. He will do the same thing this year. He will come out tonight and he will declare victory before the result is known. And when the result is known, if he loses, again, he will never accept the result. We are a representative democracy, one of the oldest democracies on the planet. If we get to a point where we have candidates who do not accept what the people choose every 2 or 4 years, we're done. And Donald Trump is doing that. That's what's at stake, really, today for America.
So you're saying that if the election, which you say is a tie at this moment and nobody can call it, if it does not go Trump's way, a January 6th could repeat?
I don't know if it will look like January 6th, but here's what I know. There will be major political violence in America in 2025. It's what Trump wanted. Again, I need to remind everybody, before the 2020 election, months before the 2020 election, Trump began lying about a stolen election. Now, why did he do that months before the election? Because he wanted his supporters to be angry when he lost. He was inciting violence. He and J.D. Vance and all of Donald Trump's media cheerleaders are doing the same thing this year. They are priming his voters not to accept the result if he loses, and then to get angry, and then to get violent. So I have no doubt that there will be violence in America if he loses. I hear from his supporters every day. They're convinced he's going to win. One of Donald Trump's biggest supporters, Tucker Carlson, said 3 or 4 days ago that it would be impossible for Kamala Harris to win unless she cheated. Now, if you tell Trump's supporters that, you're telling them that because you want them to think there's no way Kamala Harris wins. So if Kamala Harris does win, they're going to believe she cheated and they'll get violent.
But you do understand, Sanjay here was just saying that America is no longer what America used to be. And when Indians look at all of this, we have many problems, but we do the transition of power from one government to the other reasonably peacefully. And so this is very peculiar to hear you talk once again about the possibilities of political violence. But I want to play out what Trump most recently has said about the election results. He's also suggested that it could take days before the result is known. And I'm keen to find out from you and the panel what that might mean. Listen in.
And then they accuse you of being a conspiracy theorist. These are conspiracy, and they want to lock you up. They want to put you in jail. The ones that should be locked up are the ones that cheat on these horrible elections that we go through in our country. And I don't know what's going to happen, but for future elections. And then they accuse you of being a conspiracy theorist. These are conspiracy, and they want to lock you up. They want to put you in jail. The ones that should be locked up are the ones that cheat on these horrible elections that we go through in our country. And I don't know what's going to happen, but for future elections, I won't be even a part of it. But you ought to damn well go to paper ballots. You ought to go to voter ID. And you ought to have the election over by 9 o'clock. I'm hearing now they're going to take weeks. Can you imagine? They spend all this money on machines, and they're going to say, we may take an extra 12 days to determine. And what do you think happens during that 12 days? What do you think happens? These elections have to be decided by 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock on Tuesday night. Bunch of crooked people. These are crooked people.
Okay. You always have to catch a breath after you hear a Trump speech. Before I go back to the rest of the panel, Joe, do you want to explain what is this about 12 days and they have to be declared tonight? And he's basically already setting the grounds to say there's cheating if he loses. Am I understanding this correctly?
Who does that? How can anyone vote for someone who would quite literally attack our country like that? You talked about the peaceful transfer of power. That's a uniquely American thing that Donald Trump broke 4 years ago. Look, he's telling his support. He did this in 2020. He's telling his supporters the only way he will lose is if the other side cheats. That's a despicable, un-American thing to say and do. We have some of the most secure, safest elections in the world. I think the rest of the world needs to understand that every state, 50 states, they are all in charge of their own elections process. Every state does it differently. Some states, it takes a while to count all the votes for a lot of different reasons. But every vote should be counted. It's not because they're cheating. There's never, ever, ever been evidence of massive fraud or voter fraud in this country. It's a lie, but he's doing it because he doesn't want his supporters to accept the result if he loses. That's horrible.
Yeah. Let's open this up for the panel now. So Hasani, as I was saying, you listen to Trump and you kind of take a step back because the speeches are so wild. Trump has a Teflon quality. The fact that Joe Walsh says this morning, speaking from the US, the election's a tie right now. It means that there is a large section of the American people that doesn't care that Trump talks like this or are okay with it. And for their opposition, it's very complicated because you don't judge the voter, you judge the person representing them. And every time the Democrats have tried to judge Trump voters, they've got into trouble, whether it's Hillary Clinton saying a basket of deplorables or this time Biden saying garbage, even though it was a stand-up comic at a Trump rally that began that discourse first. There seems to be a Teflon quality to Donald Trump.
Certainly, and when you point out that Trump talked about garbage, you have to remember that J.D. Vance followed it up by calling Kamala Harris trash and said, we'll take the trash out. Yeah. The reason I said at the beginning that there are three outcomes that we expect is simply because of a few just facts. The first is that America is so clearly polarized that most of this election has already been decided months ahead of the actual voting date. There are very few undecideds over there. If you believe some polls, it would be as little as 2%. Secondly, we know that early voters have already come out and voted. Of 161 eligible voters in the US, 82 million have voted in early voting. So half this elections, if all those voters were to go out, more than half have already voted. So we're not actually watching a lot of these last minute campaign pitches to know where they know where they stand, and they've gone ahead and voted for it. The third is, if you look at the candidates themselves, yes, we all know what Trump did with the 2020 election. And he has spent 4 years denying that he lost, to the point where when he's asked point blank about whether he thinks he still won the election, the answer is yes. He thinks it was a rigged election. You also have to remember that Kamala Harris has not a past of denying election losses, but she does have, I think you've got photographs up of her biography, The Truths We Hold. And if you go back to the 2010 election where she stood for Attorney General, there's a description in there. The vote took 21 days to count. Her opponent announced his victory and declared victory on day one. She waited the 21 days and eventually won by a very, very small majority. So it goes to show that there is going to be a tenacity on both sides. Nobody is going to accept what comes out tomorrow unless there's a very, very major difference in the votes between the two. And even then, it seems unlikely, which is why when I say Trump, Harris, or chaos, I actually think the third might have a better odds right now than the other two, and particularly after what you've played out Mr. Trump saying over there.
Yeah, I love this line, Trump, Harris, or chaos. Joe, quickly, I was seeing you. Were you agreeing with Suhasini or disagreeing? Like, do you think it will be a while before we know the result?
Well, it could be, but again, I don't want anyone to put any other name in the same sentence with Trump, because it could take days or weeks. But if it takes days or weeks, Donald Trump will stand in front of the American people and say it's a cheat, it's being rigged. Kamala Harris will stand in front of the American people and say, let's count every vote. There's a difference between these two.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Only Trump would call it cheating if it doesn't go his way. Cleo, when you look at democracies, America was once the shining light for the sort of democratic project. It started wars in other parts of the world ostensibly to save democracy. It has a problem at home.
Yeah. So, and I would, if it's okay, as a journalist, and I know you like to be fair, and I'm not partisan, but just from what we're seeing at reporting this, Mark Halperin, who's certainly no Republican, has said that if Harris fails, you'll see the biggest mental health crisis the U.S. has ever seen on the Democrat side. And Jamie Raskin has said some things about questioning the vote in Congress, which is also concerning. So to this point of chaos, we're seeing things coming out of both sides. That's quite disturbing. In terms of the direction it's going in, because everybody mentions Dixville Notch. Dixville Notch actually last time voted 5-0 for Harris. And this time it's 3-3. So I don't know whether that's an indication of anything, but
interesting.
Yeah. And for the garbage thing, of course, if you're on the Trumplican side as opposed to the Republican side, because I think there really is a kind of a disaggregation now between the Trump Republican Party and the traditional Republican Party, you'll think on the garbage quote that that President Biden just called the entire voting population who's backing Trump garbage. Yeah. So we've had it coming in from all sides.
Yeah, I think I do feel that the Democrats have not figured out how to engage with the Trump voter, and that is a big challenge for them. But to come back to the implications, Ambassador Puri, you heard Joe Walsh. Suhasini says Trump, Harris, or chaos. Joe says you can't club Trump and Harris. Cleo says there's some crazy things coming out from the side of the Dems as well. Does it all point to a kind of wobbly America? I mean, the world is watching this with some bemusement.
Barkha, you're right. And, in some senses, we are enjoying, in some senses, we are very unhappy that the so-called leader of the world is wobbling, if I may use that expression. On the other hand, let's also, not get so much carried away by, the changes and so on. The United States is 25% of the global economy. It is by far the leading player in terms of money, finance, economy, thoughts, and so on. Yes, I know the Chinese are challenging them. But, they are the country that matters. They took a step. The entire Europeans who are as big as them in terms of the economy fell in line. That's 50% of the world gone. So let's be very clear on the fact that, this is a country which it does this in its election campaigns. Let's not forget the one between Trump and Hillary Clinton. It was also equally crazy with him making all these kinds of comments. People did what they did. At the end of the day, given the kind of economy that it is, the kind of heavyweight abilities that it has, the administrations, they don't necessarily settle down, but the state and the economy starts acting in a certain manner, and it becomes there. You have to deal with it. It becomes the important element that you have to reckon with. Remember Angela Merkel and the Germans and the Europeans having had to deal with the Americans. You have to deal with them. So let's be a little clear on one thing. No matter what we like, the shift, Indo-Pacific, rise of China, all that is fine. I, for one, would be very happy if that tilt goes a little bit more. But the fact is that now and for the next 4 years, this will be the dominant economy, the dominant player. We need to, we need to deal with them. What they do internally, what can we do about it?
Dr. Baru, do you agree with that? I think you've already made the point that America will be transactional, and perhaps so would India, where we could. The point is one president better for stability than the other, for rules-based order? Will India, we've had this big BRICS summit. You've had this sort of sudden rapprochement between the Indians and the Chinese, our country and the Chinese, a disengagement at the line of actual control. It's all happening in parallel tracks. Are we making too much of what's happened between India and China?
Well, look, frankly, of course, the United States is important. It's number one. We have to deal with them, and we will deal with them. And our relationship with the United States is improving, and it will continue to improve. I don't think those are, this is now the ABC of Indian foreign policy. But I think the real question is whether the tensions that we see, the political tensions that we see within the United States, would make any difference to India's relationship with the United States. I'm no expert on American politics, but I know something about Indian policy towards the United States. And I can tell you that it doesn't make too much of a difference, whether it's President Trump or President Harris. India will deal with both of them. India has to deal with both of them. India will deal with both of them. But how they deal with 3 or 4 issues that are there in the world today, whether it is China in the East, whether it's Soviet Union in Europe, whether it is Israel in the Middle East, will have its implications for us. And we'll have to deal with that. That's the point number one I was making. But point number two, I think how effectively we can deal with the United States will depend to a large extent on how effectively we deal with ourselves. The relationship is, it's not as if India is the only game in town for the United States. And you mentioned about the rapprochement with China. We don't have time to go into any great detail on that issue, but let me say that both India and China were made up because both of them needed to make up. There was pressure on Xi Jinping internally, there's pressure on Modi internally, and that pressure finally created some way out of a impasse over the last 4 years. And both of them will want to improve the relations with the US. China also, in my judgment, given the kind of situation its economy is in at present, China will want to improve its relations with the United States. In fact, the Chinese have made it very clear that they are not challenging the United States, right? They will not go into Taiwan. I've said this for the last 2 years in all these Delhi seminars. China is not going into Taiwan, right? Because China wants stability in its neighborhood. It does not want to destabilize its neighborhood. Xi Jinping is not a Putin. And Putin himself is, I'm sure, regretting that he went into Ukraine because he has not been able to get out. But I think for us in India, the real question is, in what position would we be in dealing with them? And the current test that we are being put to a test. I mean, our foreign minister is in Australia, is one of the Anglophone Five Eyes countries. We've had an issue with the Five Eyes, right? How do we deal with these pressures? These pressures will be there. And I think that is where our domestic performance will determine in what way Trump or Kamala Harris will look at India. If India is doing well, 7% growth, opening up its market, allowing more American investment into this country, buying more defense stuff from the United States, that's the game. If we are in a position to play that game, we
Yeah.
will count for more. If you're not in a position to play that game, we won't count for much. So, ultimately, that's the
Yeah.
ball is in our court.
I have just a couple of minutes left. Let me give Joe a closing word, and then we'll see if we have time for a couple of comments more. Joe, you have said Trump will not. You believe if the election goes adversely, Trump will not accept the result, and I take your point. My question to you is the fact that it is so keenly tied, the fact that it is so close, the fact that you, as a Trump critic, are calling it a tie, suggests something about what
Yes.
Trump is able to invoke. What
Yes.
is that?
Yes.
What is that?
Yes, Barker. Yes. And by the way, I voted for Trump in 2016. Look, Donald Trump is a horrible human being. He's a demagogue. He lies every time he opens his mouth. But we are living in a populist moment in this country like the rest of the world is. Our politics is broken. Our political system is broken. Our two-party system is broken. So in environments like this, demagogues come along and people are attracted to demagogues. That's why Trump is doing so well. I acknowledge that. We're divided. Trump didn't divide us. Trump is the product of a broken, divided system. I need to make one more quick point here. There is no both sides here. And I will not put up with that. If Kamala Harris loses this election, she will accept the result, she'll concede, she will congratulate Trump, and she will go to Trump's inauguration. If Donald Trump loses, he will do none of that. There is no both sides here.
Yeah. What are you, if you were a betting man, before we let you go, who do you think is winning?
Oh, I wish you didn't ask me that.
I know I put you on the spot, but you're the only one who's right there in the middle of sort of, the Beltway politics. Yeah.
I believe she will win by more than people think. I've been out there every day for months talking to Republicans. I think there are a lot of Republicans who are going to quietly vote for her because they're tired and exhausted with Trump. But I don't know.
Okay. May your candidate win. We'll, that's fair. Everybody has the right to hope that their chosen preference will win. Joe Walsh, I'm going to say thank you to you, to Suhasini Haidar, to Dr. Sanjay Baru, Ambassador Puri, and to Cleo Pascal. Thank you so much. We are welcoming our next set of guests now. Dileep Cherian, I see. Welcome, Dileep. If you have just joined us, we are looking at the American election. I want to play out for you what Kamala Harris said moments ago. Take a look, and we'll come right back for this special program.
And you know what, by the way, listen, we are fighting for a democracy right now. And we love our democracy, and democracy can be a bit complicated sometimes. But that's okay. We are fighting for a democracy, which is why I say that I am not going to be a leader who thinks that people who disagree with me should be put in jail, that they are the enemy. I'll give them a seat at the table because that's what real leaders do, and that's what strong leaders do. And it is my pledge to you to always put country above party and self, and to be a president for all Americans.
All right. I want to welcome Maya Mirchandani to the program. Cleo, Ambassador Puri are still with us. Do stay on. And Dileep Cherian is joining us now. We just had Joe Walsh here, who ran for president, was a Republican, a former Trump voter, saying that he thinks there are no two sides here because only one candidate will refuse to accept the result if it doesn't go his way. I just want Cleo to respond to that, and then I'll open it up for Dileep, Maya, and Ambassador Puri. Cleo, do you agree?
There was a peaceful transfer of power last time. It's one of those things where people have said about Trump before, don't take him literally, but they take him seriously, at least his followers do. I don't know, obviously, what's going to happen. But I would also just say something that we haven't talked about before, which is very much worth flagging, is what's going to happen in the House and Senate races, because that will very much determine how much power the president actually has in terms of getting some of these policies through.
Yeah, well, the only results that we have so far has come in overnight. It shows a 3-all sort of count, and I think Cleo, you made the point that in this particular constituency it was 5-0, 5-0 for Harris the last time. Joe Walsh was just saying it's dead heat. It's too close to call. It's a tie at this moment. What are the stakes? I want to bring in Maya and then Dilip, and then we'll come back to Ambassador Puri. Maya, as somebody who spent a considerable amount of time in the United States, should we look at this election only through the prism of what it means for us? Or do we look at it also as there's this completely volatile person vis-a-vis from a party that has traditionally been considered better for India, vis-a-vis someone who is seen as more stable, but is also seen to be, Republicans would say, radical on issues like Jammu and Kashmir or other Indian interests?
So, I mean, Barkha, you're right. There are absolutely two ways of looking at this. Who's going to be the better candidate for India or the better president for India? But I think, and I felt this even as a reporter in the United States for several years, that, the US election is not just to be seen from the prism of India-US relations. I think there is so much at stake domestically for the US with this election. We've seen the 2016 Trump presidency polarize America, split it right down the middle. We saw all kinds of race riots take place at that time. We saw a re-emergence rather, of white supremacist groups that took to arms, militias, the escalating level of gun violence that we have seen in the United States. So I think, we can sit here and talk about what happens with India and India-US relations all we want from tomorrow onwards when the results are clear. But I think today is America's day, and let them actually vote for what is important to them as a country. I mean, a domestic people. This is a country of immigrants. This is a country that was built on the blood, sweat, and toil of immigrants from Europe, sure, but now around the world. What are their stakes in this election? I think the rhetoric we've seen from the Trump campaign, from Trump himself, from many of his supporters. I mean, Kamala Harris, the Samoan Malaysian, Tucker Carlson called her, or the Puerto Ricans, and the kind of unity we saw, them closing around Kamala after the rally in Madison Square Garden last week. It was. I think the question really for America is, given the dead heat we see between Harris and Trump, as this election, as the polling starts today, is what kind of an America do Americans really want? And who are the Americans today? Are they a country of just, predominantly white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, white Christians? Are they a country built on, all kinds of races and all kinds of people? Civic nationalism versus ethnic nationalism. I think this is a question we used to pose to European nations or Middle Eastern nations or Asian nations. But this is the question for America today. And I think I'd like to focus on that rather than what it means for us. What it means for us, we'll answer tomorrow.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think for those who in the United States of America, and I see Christopher Shivas from Carnegie joining us now. Chris, it's good to see you. Good morning. It's quite odd that Indians are sitting here obsessing over, okay, what does it mean for us? What does it mean for us? But Dilip, we are going through a time when there is tension with the United States of America over the Khalistani factor. Cleo was just apologizing earlier in the program for Trudeau, and I was like, you don't have to do that. You're not a spokeswoman for the government. Because she's a Canadian living in the United States of America. So there's all kinds of fissures that we have, and we're sort of looking at it only through that. But this impacts the world, and it impacts America, and it impacts us in India. How are you looking at this election, Dilip?
I'm looking at it from the point of view, Barkha, of what it means for the world first. And there is no doubt that despite all the talk about the American century being over and being China's century, the fact is that for the near future, America is going to play a very important part as far as global warfare is concerned. So let's take the two biggest conflicts at the moment, and that's not to say there aren't many more that ought to be of concern to everybody. But in both those conflicts, it will matter a lot who wins.
Yeah.
At the moment, America doesn't have troops on the ground, but the fact is that if these things carry on beyond the point, what does it mean for the fabled American ability to play global peacekeeper or cop? That's one. The second thing is, what does it mean in terms of the markets? You've heard the whoosh sound of money moving out of the Indian markets. And the fact is that if America goes into a phase of expansionism, big capital is going to find it comfortable to be back home where they are rather than be in all kinds of places, including China, despite the returns. Number three, what does it mean in terms of the rules of engagement as far as immigration is concerned? Because that is also of considerable importance to many parts of the world. And I'm not talking people being smuggled across borders. I'm just talking about the numbers of people who actually work at making America great. So if one looks at it, these elections matter for the globe on account of all these three things. And I think we need to see that. And I think Americans will vote, I hope, as Maya said, based on their issues today. And I think that's the way all elections ought to go. Tomorrow, we may debate about its impact on India, but I think day after, we'll be concerned about what it means for the world, because at the end of the day, India's rise depends a lot on how the world itself is shaped over the coming years.
So let me bring in Christopher Shivis, who's at the Carnegie Endowment. Chris, one of the things that Trump's supporters like to tom-tom is that he's anti-war, and that compared to Democrats, he would want to shut down conflicts. One of his supporters on our program said, oh, he can close Russia-Ukraine in a week. Didn't make similar claims for Israel-Palestine. Do you see what happens next as having a direct impact on the world? Or do you believe that institutionally, no matter how polarized domestic opinion is at home, institutionally, in its relations with the world, not much will change?
That's a great question, Barkha, and we've been thinking about it a lot at the Carnegie Endowment over the course of the last few months. Obviously, we don't know who's going to win this election. It's a real, on the edge of our seats feeling here in Washington, D.C.
Yeah.
But if it were to be Trump, I think there's a certain amount of unpredictability in terms of what American foreign policy would look like across the three major regions of the world where the United States has been engaged, Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. So in Europe, you're absolutely right. Former President Trump has said multiple times that he intends to bring the war in Ukraine to a rapid close. Whether or not he can actually do that, I think remains to be seen. It is a really difficult problem, and he would need to do it in ways that would be at least somewhat acceptable to America's allies. There would be risks involved, but perhaps he would also succeed. And if he did, that would likely be a good thing for Europe, for Ukraine, and for America. In the Middle East, it's a very different story. I mean, he has got a real animosity for Iran, and as many Republicans do. Yeah. And so I think, what you would expect out of a Trump administration when it comes to the Middle East is doubling down on an extremely tough policy against Iran. And obviously, in the volatile situation that we're already in there with Israel's recent strikes against Iran, I think you can expect that could really go in many, many different directions, including into a much broader war in the Middle East. So in that sense, no, I'm not sure that a Trump administration would really be about peace. When it comes to Asia, it's very hard to say. I think, some of the people who would likely be, important in a foreign policy in a Trump administration certainly are very enthusiastic about the relationship with India, which I think is very important to note, just like Kamala Harris's team would be. So that's actually an interesting point of stability. But when it comes to China, what we know about Trump is lots of tariffs, right? We know that he's going to do that. What we don't know about is how hard he would go to back Taiwan. There are different factions within his camp on that. So with East Asia, it's a little bit of a wait and see policy. But yeah, in some areas, perhaps more peace. But but it's very, very hard to know for sure.
Just before I get Ambassador Puri to respond to that, that's very interesting because, I think you say one conflict, he could have some luck closing if he were to be president. But in the Middle East, or what we call West Asia, you actually see the conflict deepening because of his response to Iran. My question is, the essential unpredictability, does that in itself, have a destabilizing impact on US equations around the world?
Yeah, I mean, I think, certainly in the first year of a second Trump administration, were that to occur, we would see actors all over the world, other states, other leaders really trying to guess about what the United States policy is going to be, especially in the Middle East, Asia, also in Latin America and in Africa. And I think that creates an inherent instability. There's also the possibility that as they come back into office, a new Trump administration, if he does win the election, would misstep. They certainly did many times in the past. For example, effort to bring peace to the Korean Peninsula did not work out the way that they wanted. And that kind of uncertainty, I think, can be a little bit dangerous for the international system.
Ambassador Puri, we started this conversation with your saying the Indians would be a little happier at Trump. We do business with anybody. I think Chris acknowledges that that's one equation which probably would do better, same. But the essential possible instability that Chris refers to, how do you see that?
Barkha, thank you very much. In some senses, I'm the interloper from the previous session, so thank you for having me here. Barkha, I have no doubt that the man is both transactional as well as unpredictable. Remember, he reached out to the North Koreans. Remember, in the early months after the 2016 victory, he and the Chinese president were on a golf cart in Mar-a-Lago. So let's remember, and which is why I said, perhaps the most dangerous thing is if, in some senses, he finds some kind of a way of doing business with the Chinese as far as we are concerned. So, having said all this, I think there is absolutely no doubt that, this unpredictability is a very major issue. But I also completely agree that, this business, which the Democrats have over the years now perfected, which is hegemonic America, and the Republicans perhaps are more isolationist, if you can say so, in a globalized world in that sense. In some senses, Trump and the administration currently in power there, they tend to, represent those particular elements. So I don't want to, use this opportunity for us to have a debate on Russia, Ukraine, etc. But, there are a whole lot of sets of issues which come out of that. But the way I look at it is exactly what was said by our colleague here, that as far as India is concerned, in some senses, in relative terms, we are in a sweet spot. And, however important it is for how the Americans vote, obviously they will vote on what is important for them. They're hardly bothered about what is important for India or even what is important for Canada or for Europe or even Ukraine for that matter. But for us, obviously the important element is in the world's truly most important country, what happens, because it has implications for us, foreign policy oriented, of course, because we are not a country which is isolated and all by itself. We want to be part of the world. We want to be part of the global table and so on and so forth. Therefore, it is important for us as to, what happens there. We've managed to put ourselves, or we are in a position where we are in a position to do business with both of these two sides, with the United States, essentially. But which way things can go and what could be the results, I did say what I believe in general is the perceptions here in India that policy space availability with Trump might just be a little bit more. It may not work out in the end because you go into the minutiae of doing things. But this overall business might just be more than with the Democrats, and that's historically been the case.
Yeah. Maya, I know you said that, today is America's Day, and we've again sort of swerved back to what it might mean for the world. But it is an important question because what happens in America does impact the world, right? So the Americans may be looking at this through inflation, economy, reproductive rights, abortion, the place of immigrants. But the world is looking at it, in terms of what does it mean for China, where does it leave hegemony? Where does it leave America's propensity to get involved in countries that aren't their own? What does it do? There's been a rapprochement between India and China just recently, but Ambassador Puri reminds us that Trump is not beyond actually seeking a similar rapprochement with the Chinese himself. So what do you say?
So, I mean, I think you're right, Barkha. There's no question about the fact that while we can talk about American domestic politics, everybody's also looking at it because America impacts the world in so many ways. I mean, look, from India's perspective, I agree with Ambassador Puri in a sense that we've reached a stage where India is in a position to deal with both parties, irrespective of who comes to power in the United States tomorrow. I think for the international question, what is to me more pertinent is not whether Trump says that the Democrats are war hawks or not war hawks or whatever, but I think the way that but in particular, I won't even say the Russia-Ukraine, but in particular the Israel-Gaza conflict has played out in this election campaign, and the way there has been this unwillingness in a sense to call out what is happening in Palestine as a genocide, to call out what is happening with the bombing of children on a daily basis, the justification, the repeated justification of what happened a year ago. I think these are impacting the US election campaign in ways that I don't remember seeing the Middle East war.
But you see the two campaigns. But the two campaigns aren't fundamentally different on this question. I mean, only Jill Stein has
They're not
different
fundamentally different, Barkha. They are not fundamentally different. But I think there was a rallying around Kamala Harris because she was seen as left of center, even within the Democrats. But when she became the candidate, and there was a certain amount of expectation from liberal Democrats in America that she would speak to a younger American who's out there agitating on university campuses. They are the ones, in case people have forgotten, they're the ones who came out in large numbers to sort of support her campaign, raise the money at the beginning when she actually entered the race. And she's lost a lot of that support. I mean, the reason they're talking about Michigan in the way they are today
is the Arab American vote.
And Arab Americans who are going to sit out. I mean, they would rather not vote for anyone than vote for somebody who's ambiguous on Israel and Palestine. Right.
It's a very interesting point, and I want Christopher to respond to it, and then I'll come to you, Dilip, and then to Cleo. Because while what Maya says is a point, politics everywhere in the world, when politicians seek to be successful, they tend to push themselves towards the center. It is an inevitability of competing constituencies. That is the nature of politics, right? Politics is not driven by some pure sense of philosophy or ideology anywhere in the world. Do you think Israel, Gaza, Israel, Palestine are big factors? And do you see either presidency responding fundamentally differently? Because I don't see the difference.
I think it's obviously a question that has been on a lot of people's minds here in the United States, especially in progressive circles. And Maya is absolutely right. The issue does play a very important role. And let me just point out, for those who may not be aware, but Michigan, which we were just talking about, is a really, really important swing state. Kamala Harris's most probable path to victory includes winning Michigan, which she may or may not be able to do over the course of the next couple of days. So actually, the fact that some of these Arab Americans who would likely vote for her may sit out this election as a consequence of dissatisfaction with her not taking a tougher stand against the Netanyahu government is really consequential. As to the question of whether or not there would be big differences in terms of how Trump and Harris would approach the Middle East, yeah, I think there would be differences because I think Trump would be, as I said a couple of minutes ago, much more aggressive with Iran than a Harris administration would. And also, when it comes to the Netanyahu government, it's possible to see a Harris administration actually taking a sharper line over time once they're in office, especially if they're there for more than one term. And at a minimum, Harris would be a very different kind of an interlocutor for Benjamin Netanyahu than either a Trump or even Biden, who has a longstanding affection for Israel, has been.
Is it a big enough factor to swing outcomes or participation?
You know,
Chris?
there are a number of small little factors in this election, all of which could have, you know, very, very large effects. Things like whether or not minority men will actually vote for Trump at some of the levels that polling has suggested they would, or whether they'll decide to just stay home. The fact that, if by the same token, a number of women will actually come out and vote for Kamala Harris, even though they've been polling as undecided. I mean, there are a number of factors, and this is one on the list. So yeah, it could make a big difference.
Right. Maya, you wanted to come in. I wanted to go to Dilip, but I could see you raising your hand. Maya, were you wanting to say something?
It was
Can we unmute?
interesting
Yeah.
what
Yeah.
Yeah,
go
it
ahead.
was interesting what Chris said about the number of little small factors. I mean, I've been following for the last few days in the US press this little, what they're calling a whisper campaign, the post-it notes in women's bathrooms around, swing states in particular, and how they're running these campaigns, which are encouraging women not to be afraid of voting differently from their husbands. So, I mean, I do think, from a foreign policy perspective, I would say Israel and Gaza is an important issue, and that would determine whether people come out to vote or not. But again, I come back to my original point. At a domestic level, at a level that impacts, ordinary Americans on a day-to-day basis, she talks about the price of groceries. She talks about being able to buy her own home. She talks about, a women's rights over their own bodies. I mean, these are bread and butter issues for an American politician. And on that kind of stuff, she's hitting the right notes. But does it outweigh, hyper nationalist, populist rhetoric? I don't know.
Yeah. Those are questions, frankly, I think politicians all over the world. We've seen it in India, people trying to find that central line, Dilip, that you can walk without alienating too many people that you need on your side. What would you be, looking out for? I think American hegemony and where it leaves America is a very interesting point. We had Joe Walsh, a Republican who's a Trump critic, on earlier, and he said Trump is not going to accept the result if it doesn't go his way. And so there's a whole different sort of phase of flux. Cleo didn't agree with that, but what do you say?
I think that's an important issue, but before I go to that, I just want to say that since voting has just opened, and since the most important thing to look at is how many young people and how many women get out there to vote. That is going to be a huge, huge factor to watch for before polls close. Also, you've seen that the number of Republicans who've gone out there and voted before the polls has gone up so much more, because across America, it's very well known that, like the Panna Pramukhs, it is the Democrats who really have the ability to pull out and get people to the voting booths and to get them to cast their vote. So I think that in some senses, that dichotomy or the difference between the two parties has changed substantially, and this result will show that. Now, coming back to your much bigger question as to whether all of this has a bigger meaning and what it does to the way America will function, I think that there is no doubt that Trump will behave the way that he has been behaving. Just because his handlers have had a great grip on him for the last 6 weeks, I don't think that grip will last beyond election day. So you must, and we must all watch and be bad politics, but great television to see how these responses go as counting proceeds and as he begins to mobilize his people.
Right. I've just got a minute left. Cleo, and then Chris, if you want to take the closing comments. Cleo?
Yeah, sure. I think that it would be helpful, especially on the populist front, to take a look at things like the Somali leaders in Minnesota who endorsed Trump and see why they did it. If you look into the crosstabs in the polling, you're seeing all sorts of decisions being made for all sorts of reasons that may come out in voting in ways that are unexpected, especially as we saw, as was just mentioned in the early voting. So get out of the media sphere and listen to some of the Americans themselves talk about why they're making the decisions that they're making.
I think that's an important point because, I mean, I know even last time there was so much discussion on, everybody assumed women would not vote Trump. And then there was an entire section who did, which may be very surprising or counterintuitive. But we were talking earlier, Chris, about this kind of Teflon quality to Trump. I mean, he does actually get away with some completely outrageous rhetoric, outrageous commentary. It doesn't seem to alienate not just the traditional base, but sometimes you actually have, as Cleo mentioned, unexpected people sort of either forgiving him or ignoring that aspect or not taking it seriously. What would you be looking out for the next few hours? And do you think it's going to be a long time before America knows who their next president is? Because that's something he's suggesting. Sorry, Chris, I can't hear you. Can we unmute Chris?
I absolutely agree, Barkha. There's a quality to Trump that is has led to the reorganization of a lot of traditional ways of thinking about the sociology of U.S. politics, and that may continue as we go forward. In terms of the outcome of the election, it's very, very close, which means that we could be in a scenario where this drags on for weeks with multiple court challenges in different swing states playing out, and we don't really know who the president is for some time. On the other hand, it's also possible that you could have the opposite, which is that because each of these swing states are so close, one candidate might win them all, and we might even know as soon as tonight that one candidate has soundly defeated the other. What happens after that is, of course, another story, but perhaps you can save that for your next session.
Absolutely. Hope to have all of you back with us then. It's going to be a fascinating election, irrespective of what happens next. Cleo Pascal, Christopher Chevis, Ambassador Manjeev Puri, Maya Mirchandani, and Dilip Cherian. A pleasure. And to our audience, keep watching The Mojo Story. We will be here through the night and through the next few hours. I hope it won't take another 12 days, though. Thank you very much and see you soon. It's great to see you here. Thank you for watching our work. If you haven't subscribed yet, don't forget to click the bell icon and subscribe to Mojo Story and support independent, robust journalism.